doing our live coverage from Netroots Nation 2018 here in New Orleans. This is Richard RJ Eskow, and joining me now is my good friend and erstwhile bandmate. More about that shortly. MarkAlain Dery, MD. Dr. MarkAlain Dery is, among other things, an infectious diseases doctor, an activist, and the proprietor, if you will, of our affiliate here in New Orleans, a fantastic activist station, WHIV, here in New Orleans. And I want to talk to him about, well, I always have a lot to talk about with MarkAlain, but I think we're going to start, first of all, with welcoming you back to the program.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Pleasure to have you here in person for a change.
Yes, that's right.
Secondly, just so that our audience knows, why do I call you my erstwhile bandmate?
Ah, that's right. So you and I are in a band together. We did start when you and I first met, we started talking about music, and I had noticed in listening to your podcast that we broadcast on WHIV, you talked a lot about the Louving Brothers, and then I think you had a whole episode on Dolly Parton.
I did,
and actually, I think the Dolly Parton one was the one that caught my ear, because your knowledge of music was very deep, and it was what I refer to as Americana music or country music, which is the sort of music that I play as well. And then I think you and I exchanged text messages and emails about putting a band together that we are going to premiere here at Netroots Nation at one of New Orleans' largest stages, One Eye Jack's, and that's going to be Friday night in conjunction with WHIV. I put a band together here in New Orleans.
You did a great job too.
And we've been rehearsing, and on Sunday night, our last rehearsal, we were very eager to have you join us to see what it was going to sound like. And it sounded great. I'm actually really quite excited about the outcome.
Yeah, you guys rehearsing without me is kind of like the opposite of, do you remember Music -1? You could buy these records and it would have every part except the one you wanted to learn. It was called Music -1. You played the record, and you were kind of doing that.
Right.
I was the -1.
Right.
So now we'll see how it sounds when it's all added together. But I also wanted to talk to you a lot about WHIV and New Orleans. You guys, I really feel you've done a fantastic job, based on what I've seen, integrating yourselves into the political and cultural life of this community. But first of all, I wanted our audience, for those who might not understand, to understand what a low frequency, not low frequency, low power FM station is all about. Is that the acronym LPFM?
Yeah, LPFM, low power FM.
So maybe if you don't mind, just cluing people in a little bit on what that is.
Sure. So every 10 years, 15, 20 years, the FCC will go through and identify spots on a community dial in which they will place a low power FM radio station. And the last time they did that was in about 2014. The FCC came through and identified spots for community radio stations to go up. I think one of Bill Clinton's last act was he deregulated the media, and the radio industry was affected in the fact that there were many mergers that had occurred. And certainly at a time when I grew up in Los Angeles, initially in the 70s listening to AM radio, then ultimately moving over to FM radio when that switch happened organically during the 70s, radio was such a community-oriented thing. I mean, it was the glue that kept a community together. Now, I was a boy in the 70s, but I could still recognize the power of radio. Now, we had no other options, and we had 3 channels to choose from, so the radio still had a lot more. But I remember my community radio stations in Los Angeles, and I remember how I learned information about what was going on in the community.
Right.
I learned who was doing what and where, and of course I was a musician, so I was very interested in the musical elements of radio, obviously, as well. We've lost that with the fact that there's many of these media entities have merged into one, and certainly we've seen that in radio. So the FCC allows these low power FM radio stations. So when we think about some of the big radio giants that are here in New Orleans, they have wattages of like 500,000 watts, right? we have 100 watts. So low power FM radio station is a 100-watt radio station. But I say that as a joke to show the gross difference in what happens when you have a commercial entity, and for us being a non-commercial entity, community radio, it's a much lower in a certain way.
If I jump in for a second, MarkAlain Dery, and yet, you know, my sense is driving around New Orleans the last couple of days, I think I've been able to pick up your station everywhere here in the city of New Orleans.
Certainly. So in New Orleans, it works great because we are a little bit of a fishbowl. So we don't have much in the form of large buildings, towers, this sort of stuff. So our tower is actually at one of the highest spots in the city, and it basically showers down its radio waves onto the whole city. So for us being a low power FM radio station in New Orleans, it works very well. But if you're in a city like, let's say, Chicago, that's very large, you're really going to be only focusing on a very small part. But while I was talking, I never thought about this analogy about how the FCC prioritizes commercial radio at 500,000 watts, and that is, you know, these privatized corporate entities, but the things that, the stations that are for the community are relegated to a much smaller wattage. And I just see a large analogy of how the direction, the political direction, it seems like the country.
Right, but I'll give you another analogy in a minute, but first I'll just remind our listeners that we're speaking with Dr. MarkAlain Dery, who among other things is the proprietor of WHIV here in New Orleans. So yes, it is very much a lower priority on part of the FCC, but it's still enough to get the job done, and as far as I can tell. And so I guess my question for you would be this. First of all, I've been listening to it. I confess I haven't listened to it that much before I came to town. I've listened to it a lot since I came, and I'm going to be listening to the live stream now, because it's not just political and community service stuff. You have some great musical guests and so on. Musical programs, I should say, that I've been enjoying.
We do.
Naturally, but yeah.
So we have also, obviously New Orleans is known for its music. There's really one station that WWOZ that has been around for some 40 years. That's New Orleans, it's like the standard bearer of New Orleans music in New Orleans. Those DJs have not moved. They've held those seats, and they're very coveted seats. So when WHIV,
it's like being a Supreme Court justice.
Yeah, it's like being a Supreme Court justice. You get it. You're right. Right. Yeah. That's the only way you get a seat. If somebody. And they're bringing in Ruth Bader Ginsburg to host a show.
I wish. Well, it could be good. Yeah, could be good. I don't know her
musical choice. I don't care what it would be. I would still play him anyway. I'm hopeful it'd be a lot a Patsy Cline. You know,
listen,
right?
Yeah.
Loretta Lynn. I'm sure that would.
Well, I don't see that with RBG, but you know, we'll have to give her a shot. We should offer her a slot.
So the nice thing about WHIV is what it's done is it allowed a lot of local musicians to have a spot on the radio. And I love having musicians on air because their selection of music is almost like a kind of an insight into how their brain works. And then having them talk about the music that they select as another musician, it's really interesting to see and hear how another musician's mind thinks about music, how they link songs together, why did they cluster this particular group together. I don't do a lot of the DJing on WHIV. I focus my shows to political talk, but when I do the DJ stuff, there is a really nice. We cluster the songs together, and then we talk about why we cluster those songs together. And so when I hear other musicians talk like that, it's really fascinating.
And local musicians do have a kind of eye on the community sometimes in a way that others don't. Even non-local musicians. I interviewed Richard Thompson, the guitar player, in 2006, and we were just talking, chatting, I guess, and he said, you know, I think there's going to be a new socialist movement in the United States in 10 years. And, you know, my reaction was, okay, Richard, you play the guitar, I'll do the political prognosticating. And yet he was right. You know, I mean, there's this new socialist resurgence that began right about on Richard Thompson's schedule. So it always pays to listen to your musicians. That's been my attitude. But okay, and by the way, people might be thinking now that I am somehow giving all this positive publicity to WHIV because you're my affiliate in New Orleans, and I want to reassure people that this is my actual opinion. I would not sell myself out for a station that only has 100 watts of power. But no, I just think it's a great station. I want people to listen to it online, and I want people to. I also think you get involved in some of the issues that are. I care about New Orleans a lot. I love this city. I've been coming to the city for a long time, and as a musician, I have a particular feeling about it, and as a person who eats, because eating is excellent in this. And I guess I would say I'm so concerned about the Disneyfication of New Orleans. I'm so concerned about the Airbnb predation that, I like to. Are you guys involved in that at all in any way? Fighting the sort of corporatization of.
Yes. These are conversations that's probably the number one conversation that happens on WHIVs, either the Airbnb and or gentrification of our communities as a result of Airbnb, and or the Disneyfication of New Orleans as a result of the community affordable housing being taken off of the market stock as a result of Airbnb. So that whole cycle is probably the number one conversation being held on WHIV, and has been since Airbnb has come to New Orleans. It has massively affected communities in New Orleans, and it should come as no surprise that these neighborhoods that have been affected have been disproportionately Black and poor neighborhoods that have been historic in their ability to provide affordable housing to the various individuals that make New Orleans. New Orleans. Why do people come to New Orleans? Because of the music, because of the good food, because of the culture that is generated. And the culture that is generated by New Orleans is not necessarily generated by the folks that live uptown. The areas of town that are much more affluent. The culture of New Orleans that people come and visit are really generated, are people that live in the Treme, that live in the Marigny, and live in the Bywater. And those individuals are being priced out as a result of various entities like Airbnb, and the musicians can't afford to live in New Orleans anymore. And the issue with that is mostly having to do with the fact that they get a ring of the register. And by the ring of the register, it's usually 20%. So if you go on stage from 10 to 11, you get 20% of cast sales that are made in that time. So if you're playing great, fast music and everybody's on the floor dancing, great, people may buy more drinks. But if you're more of a reflective musician, or somebody who's not necessarily getting a bunch of folks on the dance floor to dance, and so drinks may not be selling as much, your art then is not making that money.
I do get it. We're doing a benefit, so we don't have to play faster. But so it's kind of driving the music in a different way. It's interesting how it's capitalism. Let's face it. But there's been so much great music in this town over the years. I would hate to see that change.
And they're no longer, and musicians are not able to live in New Orleans anymore. I mean, they're moving outside of New Orleans, and they're moving further and further away and having to drive in. And we're seeing that with hospitality workers as well, that they have been moved out of the various communities as a result of Airbnb, and they're having more and more difficult times being able to get into New Orleans. Our transportation isn't the best, our infrastructure isn't great as well. The streetcars only go so far as that they surround the more affluent areas of New Orleans, and so it's a struggle. It really is a struggle.
So what can, in a couple minutes we have left, what can people do who are not residents of Louisiana or New Orleans, besides listen to WHIV? Is there anything people can do to inform themselves on this issue and maybe get involved? Or?
I mean, of course, we always appreciate when people do come to New Orleans. If you do come to New Orleans, if it's possible to not stay in Airbnb facilities, please stay at hotels that are unionized. We do have one unionized hotel. This is where Netroots Nation is at, and we ask that people just tread very lightly when they do come here. And then, of course, we can be found at whivfm.org. That's where our stream is. If New Orleans is something of interest of you, there's always political talk happening on WHIV that is locally generated, in which you will understand a lot about the power issues that are happening, the LGBT issues that are happening. We have a very strong recovery community in New Orleans, and so there's some recovery programming on WHIV as well.
Okay.
We have a show called Islam in the Crescent City, in which we're talking about the issues regarding Islam in New Orleans. So there's a wide variety of shows, and so if that's stuff that's interesting to you, we'd love to have you tune in.
All right, great. Well, MarkAlain Dery,
Thank you so
MD, proprietor of WHIV, thanks for coming on the program.
Thank you so much.